The Conservative defeat in North Shropshire is another challenge for the Prime Minister.
Clearly, the vote in North Shropshire is a very disappointing result, and I totally understand people's frustrations. I hear what the voters are saying in North Shropshire, and in all humility, I've got to accept that verdict.
It follows a vote earlier this week on COVID passports in England. It passed, but the Prime Minister suffered his largest Tory rebellion. Many of the MPs who voted against the measures were the ones who originally voted him in. Conservative MP Roger GALE says Boris Johnson only has one chance left.
He's got about 3 weeks now to regroup, and he's going to have to do that very fast indeed. We've had 2 strikes. First of all, the Conservative Party in the House of Commons earlier this week. Now this result. One more strike and I think he's out.
Could this spell the end for the Prime Minister?
Whether or not it spells the end for Boris Johnson is now, of course, really in the hands of his own MPs. It seems fairly clear from everything we are being told that there are a lot of MPs who are deeply unhappy and who are at least asking themselves the question whether they should put in a letter to Sir Graham Brady to say that they want to have a vote of confidence in him. If anybody really wants to ensure that the Prime Minister is brought down, they might be wise to stay their hand until there are rather more than 55 colleagues who are of that view. Theresa May, after all, was challenged in this way during her premiership, but she managed to win the vote, although she didn't in the end manage to survive.
Is there a risk that we might be reading into one election result too much, or do you think it's a pattern?
There is always a risk of reading too much into a single by-election. And I think at the moment, the only thing that perhaps we can say with a degree of certainty, but which is a change, is that the by-election does at least demonstrate that the Liberal Democrats have reacquired the ability to be the party of by-election protest, particularly for Conservative voters. That's a role they lost in 2010. Whether or not in the end a by-election loss of this scale, which does remind one of the difficulties of John Major, which in the end did result in defeat. Well, history doesn't necessarily repeat itself twice, but it is a warning to the Conservatives that they are now in a bit of an electoral hole, and they need to start thinking about how they're going to dig themselves out of it.
He says the success of Johnson's leadership could ultimately depend on how successfully the government continues to respond to the pandemic. Jane Werrell, NTD News, London.